The area that I'm talking about in upland Southeast Asia, and it has many parallels elsewhere in the world that I'll mention in passing, has been called Zomia. It's a new name for virtually all these lands that are above 300 meters in altitude, all the way from the central highlands of Vietnam to northeastern India and going across parts of Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and Burma, 4 provinces of southwestern China, Yunnan, Guizhou, Guangxi, and parts of Sichuan. It's an expanse of 2.5 million square kilometers, and it contains about 100 million people. That is to say, the size of a quite substantial nation state, although it is at the periphery of 6 or 7 nation states and at the center of none. Zomia is the last remaining region of the world where peoples have not yet been fully incorporated into nation states. Its days are numbered. But not so very long ago, the world was filled with self-governing peoples who were the great majority of humankind. Today, they're seen from the perspective of the Valley Kingdoms as our living ancestors, what we were like before we discovered wet rice cultivation, Buddhism, and civilization. I argue, on the contrary, that these people are best understood as fugitive runaways who have, over the course of 2 millennia, and it's important to see this as a long 2,000-year process, who have been fleeing the oppressions of state-making projects in the valleys: slavery, conscription, taxes, corvée labor, epidemics, and warfare. And there are many, although I'm dealing with Southeast Asia, there are many other areas of the world in which one can sort of document this accumulation of people in what I call non-state spaces. In Southeast Asia, it happens to be the mountains, but in other places it can be swamps and so on. The people who live there in the hills are not people who never discovered civilization and Buddhism and wet rice cultivation. They are people who ran away from states for the last 1,500 to 2,000 years. The huge literature on state making, contemporary and historical, pays virtually no attention to its opposite. That is to say, the history of deliberate reactive statelessness. So this is a history of those who got away, and I would argue that state making can't be understood without it. It's a zone of tremendous cultural and linguistic variety. These areas are called, in other places, shatter zones. That is to say, areas where peoples have fled from many, many different cultural areas and linguistic zones and accumulated in a region of relative safety. And therefore, it's extremely difficult to sort of understand the incredible mosaic of languages and cultures and religious practices and cultural practices in these areas. Let's imagine that you were a consultant, a kind of modern Jean-Baptiste Colbert, and it was your job to design an agrarian system that would be best suited for a traditional kingdom. What would you do? What kind of agriculture would you design? Your job would be to concentrate grain and people within a very small radius, and the grain roughly could not be more than a couple hundred kilometers maximum away from the center of the state. Why? Because a couple of oxen carrying a cart of grain, that's the technology of the time, will have eaten all the grain in the back of the cart by the time they've gone 150 or 180 kilometers. So you can't move grain economically over much more than 150 kilometers. So you'd want to concentrate grain and people in a very, you want to pack them in to a small central area. I believe you would want to invent something like wet rice cultivation. That is to say, there's nothing like wet rice for concentrating population. It's better than wheat. It's better than maize. It's the very best for state making because of paddy agriculture. What are the advantages of paddy rice? Here I will be saying things that will seem self-evident and stupid to you, but they will make sense a little later. The great thing about wet rice is, of course, it's a grain that grows above the ground. You knew that, I know. it all becomes ripe at the same time, more or less. So if the state wants your rice, it just has to wait till it's ripe, and it can come and take it all. Or if it doesn't like you, it can just burn your rice, and then you've got to leave. Or better yet, it waits till you've cut and threshed the rice and put it in your granary, and it takes everything in your granary. You then have to leave. So if you want to confiscate or destroy or drive out a population, if they're growing wet rice, your problems are much easier than they would otherwise be. Wet rice, if it's not husked, it stores quite well. It has high value per unit weight and volume and can be taken 200 kilometers roughly successfully. So it is capacity, its value and the way in which it stores makes it a valuable state crop because it can be held as a tax. It can be distributed later and so on. Let's imagine that a group of anarchist hill tribes had hired you to be a consultant to invent the kind of agriculture and social structure that would best insulate them from being controlled by states and by governments. I think you would fall in love with the root crops. Taro, yams, sweet potatoes, and my nominee for the champion state-evading foodstuff, which is cassava or manioc or yucca. Cassava, you can plant cassava almost anywhere. It grows with almost no effort. It can easily be disguised. You plant cassava, it gets ripe in about a year with very little tending. And here's the key thing. Although you can dig it up and eat it after 11 months or so, you can leave it in the ground for another 2 years, and it's perfectly good to eat. So if the state wants your cassava, it's going to have to dig it up tuber by tuber, just the way you do. And so it is an unconfiscatable crop, right? And if you've dug a lot of tubers, then they have a cart full of tubers. It's not worth a whole hell of a lot and not worth confiscating in the first place. So that root crops are planted not just because they make sense in a certain area. They are planted because they are a state-resisting form of agriculture, agriculture of evasion, as I would call it.